Good afternoon, guys. This is David from Mid-County Farm and Feed and the Compost Pile. So today our class topic is going to revolve around composting. So we're going to talk about the basics of home composting and kind of dive into how to get started on kind of a beginner level and talk about how compost is actually created and what factors go into that. So before we get into it, I wanted to share a quick fact that was presented by Texas A&M, and that's that if we composted many of the things that we waste in our homes, such as food scraps, grass clippings, leaves, and other landscape debris, that we could eliminate up to 20 to 30% of the things going into the landfill. And it makes me think back to when I was younger, when composting and home compost bins were far more prevalent than they may be nowadays. And, obviously times have changed, society's changed. So we don't all have time to compost. So the goal here today is to kind of dive into the basics and figure out how we might be able to achieve something that's beneficial for our landscapes and our gardens, but without making it overly complicated. So first, we want to have a clear understanding of what compost is. So compost is essentially the natural process of recycling organic materials, food scraps, woody debris, leaves, grass clippings, basically anything that was once living and now that is dead. We are breaking that down and turning it into a nutrient-rich amendment that we call compost. So compost is used to improve soil structure and to help maintain soil moisture, and also to provide vital nutrients to the plant root zone, to impact the consistency of our soil, how water moves through it, and also support the microbe life. So what are the benefits of home composting? So number one, we can reduce the amount of waste that we send to landfills, which we already kind of discussed that right out of the gate with data from Texas A&M. So we could take common things that we use or have every day in the household and put it back into our homestead, or just our home if we're not really homesteading. We can improve soil structure and fertility. So we're creating healthier soil, which in turn will create healthier plants. We're helping retain water, which is a really big one here in Southeast Texas because we ideally have dense clay soil. Water tends to fill up what little gaps are in that soil very quickly, and we get a lot of watershed, a lot of water runoff, a lot of nutrient leaching. So over time, compost can help break down some of these clay soils and make a better consistency where roots and the soil food web can thrive. It also reduces the need for chemical fertilizers. So ideally, if we're composting and we're recycling things back into the soil, long term we might reach kind of a state of permanence. So we look at the concept of permaculture, where we're putting things in, we're taking things out, and then we're recycling them back in over and over again. So we're not going out and bringing in outside factors or sources, such as fertilizers off the shelf from your local lawn and garden center. And ideally, this will create an overall healthier soil. It's also going to support healthy plant growth. Compost is full of microorganisms, and microorganisms are vital to plant health. Plants make trades with microorganisms for sugars, and microorganisms give plants nutrients in exchange. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So knowing that compost is essentially created through the work of microorganisms, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we're making sure that we're keeping that soil food web alive and healthy, which in turn will create a healthy plant system. So let's look at what compost is actually made of. So it's made of two parts. We need greens and browns. So your greens are nitrogen rich material. It doesn't mean they actually physically have to be green in color. These materials provide nitrogen and help the compost actually heat up and begin to break down. Examples could be fruits and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds. We could have tea, like if you are an avid tea drinker at home, fresh grass clippings, or healthy plant prunings and debris. On the other end, we have the browns or the carbon rich materials. So they provide carbon, which help us maintain airflow. These are going to be exampled by dry leaves, straw, you could do pine needles, shredded newspaper, even cardboard, paper towels, or like small yard debris, not large like limbs and things like that. While those will compost down, they're not ideal for putting in our compost pile. And we'll touch on that a little later as well. So we're aiming for balance. We're balancing the rule of thumb of about 2 to 3 parts brown or carbon sources to 1 part green or nitrogen sources. So now I know you're thinking that's probably not like balanced, but that's the ratio we're looking for. Maybe a better way to look at it. So other things that we could use for greens could include manure. So manures are an excellent source of nitrogen. They're an excellent source of beneficial microorganisms because they're the excrement of animals. They're going through their natural gut. They're exposed to beneficial bacteria and such as they're decomposed. But we do have to be careful. We don't want to use all types of manure in the garden. You could stick to chicken, horse, cattle manure, rabbit, even goat. But most of the time, as small, like gardeners, we're not going to have cattle. Most of us are not going to have goats, as well as most of us are probably not even going to have chickens. But if we do, chickens would be the most common. Chicken manure can be very hot. It's got to be composted for an extended period of time in order for it to be able to be used inside the garden. Now, rabbit manure is a cold manure, so it means they can literally poop it out, you can scoop it up, and we can use it in the garden non-composted. Now, we can introduce that into a compost pile, no problem. When we're dealing with grazing animals, if we're collecting manure from someone and we're bringing that back to our space and we're putting it in a compost pile, we need to consider and ask questions about whether or not these things have been exposed to pesticides on the grass that they've been grazed on, because those things are consumed by the animal, they're in their body, they're excreted out, and they keep passing along as remnants of those chemicals. And we want to eliminate contamination inside of our actual compost pile, because it's not going to help the microbes stay alive or be healthy when we're putting in toxins or contaminants. Fresh manure can be too hot. So again, touching on that, if you put it in there, you want it to be compost, because if it's really hot and high in nitrogen, it's going to burn the plant roots if applied directly to the garden, and then you're going to have very poor success and honestly be frustrated. So just like most other compost recipes, you're really using 1 part manure, which is your green, to about 2 to 3 parts brown, dry leaves, pine straw, or anything else that you might have available to you. Let them fully compost down before using around vegetables and edible crops, especially because those crops are very tender and they're going to react to a hot compost much faster than some other things. So what do we not want to add into our compost? We don't want to add meat, fish, or bones. Now, while these things can be composted, they can be broken down, and there are other things that we could buy, like fish meals and bone meals that are out in the garden center, but they're processed in a way that eliminates harmful bacteria that we might not want to introduce into our garden or our food chain. So we're never going to put in meat, fish, or bones. We're never going to put in dairy either. Dairy very, very easily can introduce harmful bacteria. This includes things like eggs. You could put eggshells. There are processes where you can heat up those eggshells to basically destroy any of the bad pathogens that could be on there. But most of the time, we're going to eliminate eggs or any dairy products going into the compost pile. Oils or greasy foods. Oils, if you've ever used neem oil or some type of all seasons horticultural oil, you'll notice that they work by smothering insects. They can also smother things like microbes. So we don't want oily, greasy foods going into the pile. It's going to cause the pile to not break down. We're going to disrupt the soil food web that's helping us create this compost. And it's just going to be kind of nasty. It's going to attract varmints and pests for sure. Oils and grease, you're going to have all kinds of critters digging in there that you don't want. Pet waste is one that we're never going to put in there. Should never put pet waste in a compost pile. If we're putting any kind of used plant material that we're getting out of the landscape or the garden, we want to inspect it, make sure that it's disease free or that it looks relatively healthy. So, yellowing leaves here and there, that's one thing, if it's a stress plant. But if it has leaf spots or powdery mildews, anything like that, or it just looks uncharacteristically not healthy, we're going to eliminate that and not put it in the compost pile. We don't want to take any chance of introducing disease or other bad pathogens into our composting system. Now, you can compost things like weeds. Obviously, in the first class, I asked about weeds in the lawn. They're putting clippings in there. Sure. But ideally, you want to eliminate putting weeds in there when you have mature seeds. If you're introducing seeds into the compost pile, oftentimes those weeds can survive through that, and then they'll germinate when you go to put that compost out somewhere else, and then you've introduced yourself a new problem unknowingly. We also want to avoid any kind of chemically treated wood. So if you are someone who uses carpentry scraps, avoid like treated lumber. So like things like sawdust and stuff could go in there, but be mindful of what type of wood you're utilizing. So how do we start? Option one is to purchase a compost bin that has ventilation. So it means air can get through the sides all the way around. Number two, we can choose a level, well-drained area outdoors, and we can just create a pile. Nothing wrong with that. We don't have to have anything to start. So we're going to basically take, and we're going to layer in a layer of browns, which are our carbons, and we're going to put a little bit of our nitrogen source or our greens. We're going to add a little bit of moisture, and we're going to keep layering in there. We've got to make sure that we have moisture in here, but we also don't want it to be excessive. So if we've started and we've created a pretty good start and it's piled up, if we can grab it and squeeze it, it wants to feel like a wet sponge, but not one that we can, like a wrung out wet sponge. So it's damp, but if we squeeze it, it's not just pouring water out. If that is the case, we've got too much, and then we might need to add in some more material to reduce the moisture content, or dry material to help absorb some of that excess moisture, and keep turning it over to help move that moisture through the pile. As we get it going, we're going to need to turn this pile every 1 to 2 weeks. Oxygen is incredibly important, and that oxygen is needed for the microbes to do their work and turn the organic material that we've provided into fine, small particle compost. So we can build a compost bin if we want to do it in bin and have it in a contained area. We could do this with wire on option 1. We could get, a piece of cattle panel or some kind of welded wire, and we can cut this into pieces. We can tie wrap it together, ideally maybe in a U shape, so that we can easily access for turning it over and getting it out when we actually are finished and want to use it. We can make it about 3 to 4 foot wide. You could make it all one-sided. You could simply just put it in a circle and tie wrap it together. But if it's really tall, it may be hard to do the turning. So keep that in mind depending on what works best for you. Cattle panel or any kind of welded wire is a fairly inexpensive way to get started. You could also use wooden pallets. Oftentimes, like places like us at the feed store, pallets are always in abundance. We're dying to get rid of them. You could create a 3-sided U-shaped bin with some screws, nails, with the pallets. And those slats will help create the airflow. And then you could put a 4th pallet in front if you want, or a half pallet to help keep it in. But you're leaving those gaps for airflow. This is inexpensive. Oftentimes you can find this for free and use other things that you have around the house to build this compost pile. You could also, pallets make a great way to expand into a multi-bin system, which brings us to the 3-bin composting system. So one of the problems that may arise as a home composter is that you might have one pile, but you're constantly adding to it. You always have waste and you're adding to it. So how do you know if the compost is actually ready? So utilizing a bin system allows you to have your beginning pile, which we will call the active pile. So it's all the debris, the greens and the browns, kitchen scraps, clippings, leaves, manures, all in that bin. We're collecting. And we're going to collect until it's full. And then we're going to move that into bin 2. Bin 2 is actively breaking down. So we've layered in our components like we talked about before. We've got it damp. And we're using this particular bin to create the actual compost. So this is where all the decomposition, or most of it's going to occur. We're going to keep turning it. Once we start getting it broken down and it becomes true, nice, fine, crumbly, dark compost, then we're going to move it to bin 3, which is our curing bin. And this is where the finished compost lives that we're actually going to pull from to utilize in the garden. So essentially this is keeping us from mixing up the different stages and allowing us to have usable compost, active compost being that is being broken down, and then our active pile, which is where we're collecting for the next round of compost. So what are some common problems that we might come across in creating a compost pile? Well, number one could be just bad odors. It stinks, like not in a good way. Compost obviously smells. It's earthy. Sometimes it has like that manure type smell to it, and that's okay. But we're talking about like moldy, just nasty smelling. Often this comes from too much nitrogen, so too many greens, or too much moisture. Most of the time I would say too much moisture. Here we get an abundant amount of rain. The other day we got 10 inches in a couple hours. Everything was flooded. So your compost pile is going to be totally saturated. And if it stays wet and it's not being turned, then it's going to get that kind of nasty smell to it. And it's not actually going to be going through the process like it should. It's not going to be functioning properly. So we can take and we can add more browns or carbons, which are going to help aerate and absorb some of that moisture. And we're going to turn that pile with whatever tool we might have, a manure fork, shovel, it's kind of whatever you have. We don't need anything fancy. And we're gonna turn that, aerating it, getting some of that moisture to move through it and out of the pile. Next, maybe the pile's not heating up. Whether we're using a compost thermometer to see the temperature, or we're just filling the compost and we can feel the heat. Sometimes in the summer, you can see the pile steaming. It's easy to tell that it's heating up, but maybe it's not heating up at all and nothing's really happening. It could be too dry. If it's too dry, then we're not going to have an active microbe population. And if there's not enough greens or nitrogen, we're also not going to create that heat. So we can add water and we can add greens or nitrogen-based material to help combat that issue. Next, flies or pests. Flies and pests become problematic whenever you have a lot of food scrap content and that food scrap content isn't actually buried. So if you just throw it on top, then you're going to attract a lot of varmints. You could get possums, raccoons, things that you don't want digging in there. You could get fruit flies. A lot of this will happen if your food scraps are left up on top and exposed to the sun too much. It can also happen if it stays excessively too wet. So if we're seeing a lot of flies or pests, we want to cover the scraps with browns and also make sure that our pile is not too damp. If our pile is too wet, we could be experiencing the bad odor problem above, or maybe it's not to that point. Maybe we haven't gotten to that far along. If it's too wet, it means we either have poor drainage in our pile or we've got excessive nitrogen. We're going to turn and add more browns. So we're adding more carbons that are going to help aerate, and we're going to continue to turn that pile, helping the moisture even out. So when is it ready? When is it ready is kind of a hard one to say. You know, when you hone your craft and your process, you'll figure out how long, based upon what you're putting in to the compost pile, as to how long it's actually going to take. So different settings take different amounts of time. It could range anywhere from 3 to 12 months. In the earlier months, the compost pile is going to be hot, sometimes with steam, and around the 6-month mark, depending on the process, it is going to begin to slow down and it will begin to cool down. You can feel that by touch. So finished compost is going to be dark brown or black. It's crumbly and soil-like, so it's going to have a much finer texture. It is not going to be recognizable as the original materials in which you put in it. So whether there was, twigs, small branches, food scraps, none of that is going to be there. It's going to look like very deep, rich soil, essentially. And it's going to have a very prominent earthy tone to it. It's not going to be like moldy or musty smelling. It's going to smell very earthy. The biggest thing you could tell a lot of times by looking at the color. Compost is always a dark, rich color, and that's because it is a living thing. So once we actually create that finished compost, we can mix it into garden beds before planting. We can top dress around veggies, flowers, shrubs, potted plants. We can even, if we're a lawn guru and we just love grass, we could aerate our lawn and then we could top dress with compost, like a 1/4-inch layer, very, very fine layer, and it will actually really make your yard fire off. It's one of the most interesting ways to see the power of compost is by top dressing a lawn. We can blend it into potting soil or any other soil that we might be using so that we're getting a more nutrient dense soil that is going to help long-term create healthy plant growth. So a couple quick things that we can do to ensure that our compost pile is successful. Number one, we could take materials and we could chop them finer. So if we have small twigs or we have like really, really large leaves that are very thick and fibrous, we can mulch them up, break them down to smaller pieces, and they will break down faster. Think of it like a food processor. You're chopping it up, making it smaller so that it can break down in a quicker amount of time. We want to keep our compost moist but not soggy. We don't want it so saturated we can wring it out and it drips water. The key is compost is it's laborsome. We've got to get out there and we've got to turn it. Microbes need oxygen in order to be able to do their work as much as they need moisture and organic matter. Next, it's always a good plan to add a variety of materials. This is going to help make your compost more nutrient dense. It's also going to make your compost potentially break down faster. Certain items carry more of certain things than others. And it's just a good way to essentially ensure that you're recycling as many things as you can back into a usable form. Lastly, be patient. Nature does the work. We are just there to help along the way. It will not be easy. So we'll see how it goes. Lastly, before we finish up today, I wanted to touch, and I will see about adding this later on to the links. It is not on the handout that I have in the links today. Is first we're looking at what creates the compost. And I keep talking about the soil food web. Bacteria is the first responder essentially to composting. Bacteria, they arrive, they start breaking down stuff into simple sugars and proteins, and they generally are going to generate the heat. They're the ones that are grabbing onto those nitrogen sources and breaking down the nitrogen. They rapidly multiply. So they're very quick to get established, and they're what is going to cause the compost pile to actually heat up to the target range of 130 to 160 degrees. Next, fungi come in and they're breaking down the woody fibrous materials. So all of the leaves and the carbons, they're breaking it down. If you've ever cut down a tree or anything like that in your yard, you see fungi growing from the ground, or hard nodules that are the fruiting bodies of fungi. That's what they're doing. They're breaking down the woods, the cellulose. So it's pretty cool to see that happen. You also have protozoa and nematodes, which they are kind of the predators. They're regulating the fungi and bacteria population, making sure they don't get out of control, but at the same time, they're leaving behind beneficial, how would I describe it? They're leaving behind beneficial nutrients and cycling nutrients is what I'm looking for back into the soil. You also have arthropods, earthworms, so things that are in there shredding up small materials, excrements like worm castings, so it makes it immensely beneficial for the soil, and they're also aerating that pile, and it's easy access. That's why you want a smooth soil bottom on your compost pile, because you want those native worms and things to move in, start populating, and help that compost thrive and become even more nutrient dense. So you can also, if you are using manure, manures don't just provide nutrients, they also introduce some of these beneficial microorganisms. So they do hold their place. So that's kind of cool. You're populating some of those just by some of the actual green sources that are going into the pile. So at the end of the day, compost is incredibly valuable. It's supplying microorganisms, it's supplying humus, nutrients, it is putting organic matter in. Just overall, it helps your soil stay healthier, retain moisture, retain nutrients, and overall give you healthier plants. So that's kind of where we're going to wrap up today. I encourage you to, if you're thinking about doing a compost pile, or maybe you've started one and you've had mediocre success, don't overcomplicate it. Start with the basics and dial in a very simple system. Don't make it some outrageously big ordeal. Start somewhere, learn. If you have questions, reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you along the way. So thank you guys for listening in today, and we'll catch you next time.